How effective are congressional committees? So we're looking at how the role of committees in Congress has changed and evaluating the impact this has had on Congress. So first of all, I'd like to think about what are the functions of congressional committees, why they exist, and what are they there for. Committees have been referred to as Congress at work. This was something that Woodrow Wilson said, along with saying that the main chambers were just for show, and actually the majority of the important work done by Congress happened in the committees. This is because most of the legislative work and scrutiny happened in the committees. Don't forget, beyond a first formal reading, most of the time spent on debating and amending legislation happened in the committee process. And secondly, scrutiny can only really happen in the committees, as government employees or secretaries of state or members of different departments can only be called to committee hearings. It's not like the UK, where the cabinet ministers are members of the parliament as well, so can be called to account during the main chamber sessions. So it is really only in the committees that scrutiny happens. And also, the committee chairs were traditionally very powerful. Some had served for decades and built up great expertise and respect. Now, a key question is this still the case? Increasingly, it seems that the committee has become less important in both chambers. Now, to some people, this might seem like a good thing, as the committees were sometimes criticised for being too powerful with their ability to table bills. However, it appears that the power has not gone back to the main chambers of Congress. Actually, it is the leadership of Congress who have seized these extra powers and now dominate Congress. So we're going to look at both legislation and scrutiny to see how this has changed. So the declining power of the committees over legislation can be seen in three main areas, which we will look at individually. First of all, the standing committees themselves. Secondly, the use of the discharge process in the House. And thirdly, the use of conference committees. Now, with the standing committees, a series of reforms were put in place to try and weaken the power of the chairman, who was seen to be too powerful. So, first of all, the chair was selected by secret ballot rather than chosen. The hearings and the work of the standing committees are now open to press and public to avoid accusations of being secretive and too powerful. There's an increased role of subcommittees, where they're given their own powers and authority of their own. And the leadership appoints committee members and can give legislation now to more than one committee to look at. Perhaps most importantly, the Republicans put in place a rule that chairmen now only sit for 6 years in the House, meaning that the days of the very experienced, very powerful, long-term chairman of a committee in Congress is now a thing of the past. Now, the best example of this impact is with the Affordable Care Act, where, also known as Obamacare, where it was very clear that it was the House and Senate leadership who worked on the bill, and it was both Nancy Pelosi in the House and Harry Reid in the Senate who were driving the different deals and bargains made to get this act through Congress. So it became clear that the power of the committees has largely been eroded. A small but significant example of this is the use of the discharge process in the House. Now, this is a mechanism for the House to move a bill through the committee stage to avoid it being tabled, usually used as a bipartisan measure if a particular committee did not consider a bill that was very popular, the House could force it through. It's traditionally rarely used. It requires a majority of the House to vote for it, and it tends to offend the chairman of that committee. However, it's become more common since the 1990s, with 18 passed in 2007 to 8, up from 8 in 1997 to 8. And in the last Congress, 12 were passed. Also, many more House members are signing them, so even the ones that do not get passed are typically getting more than 100 to 160 votes to push them through, showing there is more support for undermining the work of the committee and pushing things through in the main chamber of the House. And actually, rather than being a bipartisan kind of safety valve for particular bills, they're being used more and more as a partisan way to get bills through other party-controlled committees. Another particular example of the declining power of the committees is in the conference committees. Now, these are designed to reconcile the differences between versions of a bill in the House and the Senate. However, this is hugely declined in use, with differences now normally worked out by the leadership of both chambers, and what we call a ping-pong approach being taken, where the bill is simply fired between the two different chambers until there is agreement. We can see this that because there were 50 conference committees in 1999 to 2000, yet in 2013 to 14 there were only 3. Now, an area where there has not seen much change is in scrutiny of the executive. The only real change here has been that it's become a bit more of a pantomime, a bit more aggressive as Congress has become more partisan. It's much more likely to be aggressive hearings of members of the executive, particularly now we have a divided government with a president from one party and Congress being controlled by the other. An example of this being effective is that of Julia Pearson, the former director of the United States Secret Service. Now, Pearson came under increasing pressure due to questioning in a standing committee, the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, about her handling of presidential security, where it became clear that there was a series of security gaffes over a period of a couple of years, which undermined her position as director. As this more information was revealed, particularly through the questioning of the committee, it became clear that her position was untenable, and 24 hours after the committee hearing, she resigned. Now, this shows the power the hearings can have in looking at the executive branch of the government, in a relatively small example. So how effective are the committees? In terms of legislation, it would appear that a lot of their power has been seized by the leaders of Congress. And ironically, this was largely to try and break up the power of the committee chairman, but instead of giving it back to the chambers or to the actual committee, what seems to have happened is the leaders of Congress have seized this power. However, they're still very important in terms of scrutiny of the executive, and in fact are one of the main areas where scrutiny still happens, although slightly tempered by the partisan nature of that scrutiny. It is also clear that powers that committees have been weakened, and that perhaps returning some powers might see a more effective Congress. So in summary, the work of the committees is traditionally seen as very important. However, in recent years, there has been a decline in their importance. Much of the power of the committees has been taken from the committee chairman and been seized by the leaders of the two chambers of Congress. So, for example, standing committees' powers over legislation have been reduced. More bills are being put through committees through discharge procedures. Conference committees have largely disappeared, but they are still important in scrutinising the executive. So what do you think? Why might undermining the committees be damaging to the US system? And secondly, how do you think this links into the current legislative gridlock in the US? This has been a Flip Your History video. More information and more videos are available on TES if you search Flip Your History, or for more information about Flip Learning and my Flip Learning journey, go to Twitter at Flip Your History or my blog flipyourhistory.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening.